At first it feels familiar. The horizon glows with a soft line of light, and the world seems to wake in the same quiet way it always has. A gentle brightness spreads across the sky, touching the surface of the earth with a calm, steady presence. There is nothing alarming in this moment, nothing that suggests anything is wrong, and yet something is not quite as it should be. The light arrives, but not with certainty. It lingers longer than expected, stretching the day beyond its usual shape, as if time itself has forgotten where it is meant to end. Shadows move slowly, then suddenly faster, then slow again. The rhythm is uneven, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore once it is noticed. Night does not follow when it should. It arrives without warning, sometimes too soon, sometimes much later, as though the planet cannot decide when to turn away from the light. Darkness settles in uneven layers, quiet but uncertain, covering the land without the comfort of expectation. There is no clear boundary, no reliable return. In this world, the idea of a day begins to lose its meaning. What was once a steady cycle becomes something fluid, something that shifts and bends without pattern. The passage of time cannot be measured by light alone, because light no longer behaves in a way that can be trusted. Across the surface of the earth, small signs begin to appear. Plants open and close at strange intervals, no longer guided by a predictable rhythm. Some bloom too early, others too late, and many fail to align with the conditions they need to survive. Growth becomes uncertain, tied to a system that does not repeat. The oceans reflect this instability in quieter ways. Their surfaces shimmer under inconsistent light, warming and cooling without warning. Currents shift direction subtly, responding to forces that never settle. What appears calm from a distance carries a deeper unease beneath it, as if the entire planet is adjusting moment by moment. There are no true seasons here, not in the way we understand them. Warmth does not return when expected. Cold does not linger unpredictable. Instead, the environment drifts between states, never fully committing to one condition before slipping into another. The world feels unfinished, as though it has not yet decided how to behave. And within this uncertainty, a quiet question begins to form. If nothing repeats, if no cycle can be relied upon, how does anything endure? How does life find a way to exist in a system that offers no promise of tomorrow resembling today? The answer is not obvious, and perhaps it never was. The familiarity of the present begins to dissolve. The steady rise and fall of days, the comfort of seasons, the quiet expectation that time will continue as it always has, all of it feels less certain. What seems stable now begins to reveal itself as something that may have once been fragile, or even absent. And so the moment lingers, stretched between what is known and what is no longer certain. The light fades again, not on schedule, but in its own quiet decision. Another cycle ends, if it can be called a cycle at all, leaving behind a world that cannot depend on repetition. The sky darkens, the air cools, and the earth continues its motion, not guided by rhythm, but by forces that have yet to settle into harmony. Somewhere beyond this shifting pattern, something larger is at work, something that will eventually shape this instability into order, though that order has not yet arrived. And as the silence of night deepens, a quiet realization begins to take hold, almost unnoticed. The instability of the day is not random, not meaningless, but part of something deeper, something that extends far beyond the turning of the earth itself. The question is no longer whether time is broken, but why it behaves this way at all. We begin to sense the cause may lie beyond the sky. From the surface, the change in light felt strange, but its cause remained hidden. To understand it, the view must move outward, beyond the clouds, beyond the quiet turning of the world, into the vast darkness where the planet drifts. From this distance, Earth does not appear steady. It does not hold itself upright in a fixed way. Instead, it leans slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if it cannot decide how to balance. This lean is not constant. It shifts slowly at times, then with subtle urgency, like a spinning object that has not yet settled into its center. The planet tilts, then tilts again, never quite returning to the same angle. The motion is quiet, but its consequences are not. Light falls differently across the surface with each change, touching regions in ways that cannot be predicted. In one moment, warmth stretches far across the land, reaching places that should remain cool. In another, the same regions fall into Sutan, as though the light has There is no gradual transition, no gentle shift between states. Instead, the world moves in steps. Steps. What we would call seasons cannot form here. There is no steady progression, no reliable pattern that repeats over time. Warmth does not build into summer, nor does cold settle into winter. The idea of a cycle has no foundation, because the angle that shapes it refuses to remain still. The planet behaves like something searching for balance, but never quite finding it. The image is simple, almost familiar. A spinning top, set in motion, holds steady only when its movement is strong and its center is secure. But as it begins to lose that stability, it wobbles. Its axis shifts, tracing uncertain circles through the air. Earth, in this early state, seems to mirror that motion, not fixed, but adjusting, drifting, correcting, and then drifting again. And with every shift, sunlight changes its path. Regions that once received steady light are suddenly turned away, while others are exposed more directly than before. Entire climates rearrange themselves in response, not over long periods, but in abrupt, disorienting intervals. The surface becomes a place where conditions cannot be trusted to remain even for a short time. This is not a small detail hidden in the mechs of the planet. It is the foundation upon which everything else depends. Without a steady tilt, there is no consistent distribution of energy, no reliable contrast between regions, no framework for patterns to form. The stability we take for granted is absent here, replaced by a system that is always in motion, never settling into agreement with itself. And yet, this raises a deeper question, one that lingers beneath the shifting light and unstable days. If the planet could not hold its position, if its balance was constantly changing, what allowed it to continue at all? What kept it from falling into complete disorder, from losing any sense of structure entirely? Something is missing from this picture, something that has not yet appeared. It is not visible from the surface, and not immediately obvious from space. The forces that guide the planet are quiet, almost invisible, working without sound or sign, but their absence is felt in every uneven shift, every broken rhythm, every moment that refuses to repeat. The instability is not random, it is the result of something that has yet to take its place. And as the planet continues its uncertain motion, a subtle tension builds beneath the calm of space. The imbalance cannot continue forever. Something must eventually change. Something must arrive or align in a way that allows the world to steady itself. The question is not whether balance will come, but what will create it, and how long the planet must wait before that quiet correction begins. The answer rests beyond, just outside the reach of sight. At first glance, life should not exist here. The conditions do not allow for comfort or repetition. Light shifts without warning, stretching and fading in ways that no living system can predict. The waters warm and cool without pattern, rising into brief moments of energy before falling again into stillness. Nothing remains the same long enough to be understood or trusted, and yet something does exist. Beneath the surface of these restless oceans, small forms of life begin to take hold. They are simple, almost invisible without structure or plan, but they persist. They do not wait for the world to settle because it never does. Instead, they respond in the moment, adjusting to whatever conditions appear around them. There is no expectation of tomorrow being similar to today. Growth begins when it can, stops when it must, and resumes again without rhythm. Energy is taken whenever it becomes available, and lost just as quickly when it disappears. Survival is not built on consistency, but on constant change. In this world, flexibility becomes the only advantage. Life cannot specialize, cannot depend on cycles, cannot prepare for what comes next. It must remain open to everything, ready to shift without hesitation. Each moment is separate, disconnected from the last, forcing every living thing to exist without certainty. And in that uncertainty, something unexpected begins to emerge. It happens faster here than it ever could in a stable world. Forms adjust, not affine themselves, not over long stretches of time, but in IB'd response to shifting condition. The pressure to survive is constant, and with it comes the need to adapt to stability. Does not stop life. It pushes it forward. The lack of order becomes a quiet force of creation, driving life to explore possibilities that stability might never require. What seems like chaos begins to reveal itself as something more complex, a system where survival depends on the ability to respond instantly without memory of what came before. There is no long-term strategy, no sense of planning, only a continuous adjustment to the present. Each moment replaces the last, leaving no room for expectation. Life becomes something fluid, shaped by whatever the world demands at that exact instant. But this comes with a cost. Without reliable patterns, nothing can build over time. There is no steady progression, no foundation for complexity to grow in layers. Everything must begin again over and over, shaped only by the immediate conditions that surround it. And still, life continues. It does not question the instability because it cannot. It exists within it, shaped by it, carried forward by forces it does not understand. There is no alternative, no other way to exist. Only the present moment remains, repeating without repetition. And as this fragile existence continues, a quiet realization begins to form. This world cannot remain like this forever. The imbalance that shapes every moment carries within it the possibility of change. Something must eventually shift. Something must begin to settle. Because even in this uncertainty, there are hints of something more. Small consistencies appear, faint patterns that almost repeat before fading again. The system is not completely without structure, only incomplete. And somewhere within this instability, the foundation of something steady begins to take shape. It is not yet visible, not yet reliable, but it is there, waiting, forming, preparing to transform everything that exists. The question is no longer how life survives in chaos, but how long that chaos can continue before something alters its course. The answer does not reveal itself yet, but its presence can be felt in the subtle shifts of the world, in the quiet suggestion that balance is possible, even if it's not arrived yet. And, as the restless cycle continues, stretching without pattern, a deeper force begins to move into place, preparing to bring order to what has never known it. Soon. From the surface, the instability felt like a problem within the planet itself, as if Earth simply had not yet learned how to move in a steady way. But when the view shifts outward again into the vast silence that surrounds it, a different picture begins to form. The planet is not alone, it has never been alone. Space from a distance appears empty and still, but it is anything but quiet. It is filled with invisible tensions, constant forces pulling and stretching in every direction. Earth moves through this environment not as a free object, but as something caught within a network of influence, guided by forces it cannot escape. The sun holds the planet in a steady path, its presence immense, its pull constant and unrelenting. But that pull is not the only one. Other bodies, distant yet significant, exert their influence as well, adding subtle variations to the planet's motion. Each force is small when considered alone, but together they create a system of shifting balance, where nothing remains perfectly aligned for long. Earth responds to these forces in quiet, continuous adjustments. Its path remains mostly stable, but its orientation, its subtle leaning, its internal balance, the planet is not simply rotating in isolation. It is being guided and by the presence of everything around it. The motion begins to resemble something more familiar. A boat resting on open water, surrounded by currents that move in different directions. No single current dominates completely, but together they create an unpredictable path. The boat does not decide where it goes, it reacts, adjusting to forces that are always shifting beneath it. In the same way, Earth does not fully control its own balance. Its tilt, already unstable, becomes even more uncertain under these competing influences. The angle shifts not just because of its own motion, but because of the constant, invisible interaction with its surroundings. Each pull, each subtle force, adds another layer of variation, making it even harder for the planet to settle into a steady rhythm. And so, the instability deepens. What might have become stable over time is instead amplified, stretched into greater unpredictability. Light continues to fall unevenly across the surface, but now the cause is clearer. It is not just the planet struggling internally. It is the result of a larger system, one that extends far beyond the Earth itself. This realization changes everything. The chaos is no longer contained. It is not a flaw in the planet, but a condition of its environment. Earth is part of something much larger, something that shapes its behavior in ways that cannot be ignored. And yet within this system there is a subtle imbalance. The forces are present, but they do not cancel each other out. They do not create harmony. Instead, they pull in ways that leave the planet slightly off-center, never fully aligned, never fully stable. It begins to feel as though something is missing, not a force that disrupts, but one that steadies. Something that could counter these shifting influences, not by overpowering them, but by balancing them. The system feels incomplete, as if one essential piece has not yet taken its place. Without it, the planet continues its uncertain motion, adjusting endlessly, never quite settling. The instability is not random. It follows from the absence of something that could bring order to the surrounding forces. And as the Earth continues to drift within this invisible web, a quiet question begins to take shape. If all these forces are already in motion, if the system is already this complex, what could possibly be missing that would change everything so completely? The answer is not yet visible, but its absence is felt in every uneven shift, in every moment that refuses to repeat. Somewhere within this vast system, there is a role unfilled, a presence not yet accounted for, one that will eventually redefine the balance of the entire planet. And when it arrives, nothing will behave the same way again. There is something familiar in the night sky, something so constant that it rarely invites attention. It rises without effort, follows a quiet path, and fades again, returning with a rhythm that feels dependable. Its presence is gentle, almost unnoticed, yet it has always been there, watching without interruption. We know it as part of the sky, something natural, something expected. It reflects light rather than creating it, offering a softer glow that never overwhelms. It seems passive, distant, without influence, and yet its role is far greater than it appears. Today, it moves with quiet precision, circling the Earth in a way that feels steady and controlled. Its presence pulls gently on the oceans, guiding the rise and fall of tides. The waters respond in a rhythm that repeats, stretching and returning in a pattern that life has come to depend on. This motion is subtle, but it carries a consistency that shapes the behavior of the entire planet. And beneath that quiet influence, something even less visible takes place. The planet itself holds its position more steadily. Its tilt, though never perfectly fixed, remains within a narrow range, allowing sunlight to fall across the surface in a way that repeats over time. Seasons form from this stability, growing out of a balance that feels almost permanent. But this is the present, this is the world as it is now. To understand what came before, that presence must be removed. The sky changes instantly, though nothing seems to move. The familiar glow disappears, leaving behind a darkness that feels deeper, more complete. There is no quiet companion tracing its path above, no steady motion reflecting light back to the surface. The night becomes still empty in a way that feels unfamiliar. And with that absence, something else begins to shift. The oceans no longer follow a clear rhythm. Their movement weakens, becoming less defined, less reliable. The rise and fall of the tides loses its consistency, no longer by a steady pull, moves but not in the same structured way. Its behavior becomes unpredictable, responding only to the main forces that cannot was. The change does not stop there. The planet itself begins to feel the difference. Without that quiet influence, the tilt that was already unstable becomes more uncertain. It shifts more freely now, drifting beyond the narrow range that once kept it in balance. The wobble increases, subtle at first, but growing over time. Light follows this change immediately. The way it reaches the surface begins to vary more dramatically, no longer guided by a stable angle. Regions of the planet receive inconsistent energy, warming and cooling without pattern. The fragile beginnings of seasons fail to take hold, slipping away before they can form into anything reliable. What once seemed like a system struggling to stabilize now reveals something deeper. It was not only missing balance, it was missing a force capable of holding that balance in place. The realization settles quietly, almost without resistance. The instability described before was not simply a stage of development, not just a temporary condition. It was the natural state of a planet without this presence. And that presence, so familiar now, so easily overlooked, becomes something entirely different. It is no longer just part of the sky. It is a stabilizer, a quiet anchor that shapes the behavior of the entire world. Without it, the chaos does not fade. It continues, amplified by the absence of anything strong enough to counter it. The forces described before remain, still pulling, still shifting, but now with nothing to guide them into balance. The system feels incomplete again, but now the missing piece is clearer. It is not just an unknown force, but something specific, something that, when present, changes everything. And as this understanding deepens, another question begins to form, more focused now, more precise. If this presence has the power to steady the planet, to shape its tilt and guide its cycles, how did it come to take that role? How did something so quiet become so essential? The answer lies in its arrival, and in the slow, almost invisible way, it began to force Hesfers into something that could finally lap. The change does not arrive all at once. There is no single moment where chaos ends and order begins. Instead, it unfolds quietly, almost too slowly to notice. The planet continues its motion, still influenced by the same forces, still carrying the memory of imbalance. But something has begun to shift. At first, the difference is subtle. The tilt no longer drifts as freely as before. It still moves, still adjusts, but within a narrower range. The wide, unpredictable swings begin to soften, replaced by smaller, more controlled variations. The motion that once felt uncertain begins to show the earliest signs of restraint. Light responds immediately. It still changes across the surface, but not as abruptly. Regions that were once thrown between extremes now experience transitions that feel slightly more connected. Warmth lingers a little longer before fading. Cold retreats more gradually, rather than disappearing without warning. The changes are small, but they begin to repeat. Repetition, even in its faintest form, carries a quiet power. The world starts to experience moments that resemble what came before. Not perfectly, not consistently, but enough to suggest that something is beginning to align. The idea of a pattern, once absent, begins to take shape. The oceans reflect this shift with a gentle response. Their movements grow more structured, their changes less erratic. The rise and fall of energy within the water begins to follow a rhythm that, while still incomplete, hints at a growing consistency. The surface no longer feels entirely unpredictable. It begins to settle into a flow that can almost be followed. Across the land, the effects are just as quiet, yet just as significant. Conditions that once changed without warning now begin to linger. Certain environments hold their state longer, allowing processes to continue without rupture. Growth, which once struggled to begin, now has moments where it can sustain itself, even if only brief. These are not yet seasons as they will be known. They are incomplete, still forming. Warm periods arrive, but not always at the same time. Cooler intervals follow, but their duration is uncertain. The system is learning, adjusting, moving towards something it has not fully reached. And within this gradual shift, a realization begins to emerge. Stability is not an event. It is not something that appears suddenly and remains unchanged. It is built, piece by piece, through the interaction of forces that slowly come into balance. What seems simple in the present is the result of countless small adjustments, each one contributing to a larger pattern. The presence that was once missing now begins to reveal its influence, not through dramatic change, but through quiet correction. It does not stop the motion of the planet. It refines it. It narrows the possibilities, guiding the tilt into a range that allows patterns to form and repeat. And as these patterns strengthen, something new becomes possible. The world begins to move toward a state where conditions can be expected, where changes follow a sequence rather than appearing without warning. It is not yet reliable, not yet fully formed, but it is no longer absent. The first signs of order are not bold or obvious. They are soft, almost hidden within the larger motion of the planet, but they are there and they are growing. Each cycle carries a trace of the last, each shift building upon what came before. Yet even in this progress, there is a quiet tension. The balance is not complete. The system is still adjusting, still vulnerable to rupture. The patterns that are forming could still break, could still drift back into if the forces that shape them fall out of alignment. Stability has begun, but it has not yet settled, and as the planet continues its slow movement toward balance, a new possibility begins to take shape. If these patterns continue to strengthen, if this quiet order continues to grow, then something more profound may follow. Not just a stable world, but a world where life can finally depend on what comes next. That moment has not yet arrived, but it is closer now than it has ever been. It begins so quietly that it could easily be missed. The horizon brightens again, much like it has before, but this time there is something different beneath the light. It does not arrive with certainty, not yet, but there is a faint sense that it has been here before in a similar way. The glow spreads across the sky with a softness that feels almost familiar, as if the world is beginning to repeat something it once forgot. The sunrise is not exact. It does not follow a perfect schedule, and it does not return at the same moment each cycle. But it is close enough for the mind, if it could notice, to recognize a pattern forming beneath the variation. Light reaches the surface and lingers with a little more consistency. It no longer stretches endlessly or vanishes without warning. Instead, it begins to follow a loose rhythm, one that connects each moment to the last. The changes are subtle, but they carry weight. Darkness still comes, but it does so with less unpredictability. The transition between light and shadow begins to soften, forming a sequence that can almost be followed. The world is not stable, but it is no longer completely uncertain. Across the oceans, the response is immediate. The water absorbs energy during these periods of light, holding it longer than before, releasing it more gradually as darkness returns. The surface no longer shifts without pattern. Instead, it begins to move in cycles that echo the behavior of the sky above. Temperatures follow this change in quiet agreement. Warmth builds not always at the same pace, but with a direction that can be sensed. Cooling follows, not abruptly, but with a gradual return. The extremes begin to soften, replaced by transitions that connect one state to another. And within these changes, something new begins to happen. Life, which once existed only in reaction, begins to respond differently. The smallest organisms drifting within the water start to align themselves with the presence of light. Activity increases when brightness returns, slows as darkness settles. It is not a decision, not a conscious act, but a shift in behavior shaped by repetition. There is no understanding yet, no awareness of time, but there is a response to it. The world begins to influence life in a way that carries memory, even if that memory is only written into patterns of behavior. The difference is subtle, but it is profound. For the first time, there is something that resembles expectation, not a clear prediction, not a reliable schedule, but a sense that what happens now may happen again. The present begins to connect to the future, even if only faintly, and in that connection, opportunity begins to form. When conditions repeat, even imperfectly, they allow processes to continue. Growth can extend beyond a single moment. Energy can be gathered with some sense of continuity. Life begins to move not just with the environment, but alongside it. This is not yet the world we recognize. The patterns are fragile, incomplete, still shifting beneath the surface. But they are there, and they are growing stronger with each cycle that follows. The sunrise, once a random event, begins to carry meaning. It becomes more than a moment of light. It becomes a signal, a marker within a sequence that is slowly taking shape. And as this sequence develops, the world begins to change in ways that cannot be reversed. The presence of repetition introduces something that chaos never allowed. It introduces the possibility of building upon what came before. The planet is beginning to remember, not in thought, not in awareness, but in behavior, in motion, in the quiet alignment of systems that are slowly learning to move together. The cycles are still imperfect, still uncertain, but they are no longer absent. And as this fragile rhythm continues to strengthen, a deeper transformation begins to unfold. Life is no longer simply enduring the world as it is. It is beginning to respond to what the world might become. That shift, quiet as it is, will change everything that follows. At first, the changes in life are almost invisible. The smallest organisms continue their quiet existence, drifting within water, absorbing what they can, responding as they always have. But beneath that familiar motion, something begins to shift. The world around them is no longer entirely unpredictable. Light returns not perfectly, but often enough. Warmth rises and falls with a loose rhythm. Nutrients move through the environment in patterns that begin to repeat. And life begins to notice, not with awareness, but through response. Activity increases when light lingers. It slows when darkness deepens. The change is subtle, but it is consistent enough to shape behavior. Instead of reacting randomly, these simple forms begin to align themselves with the faint cycles emerging around them. Growth becomes slightly more organized. Cells divide more often during periods of available energy, less during moments of decline. It is not planned, not controlled, but it follows a pattern that reflects the world beyond them. The environment begins to guide life in a way it never could before. Reproduction, too, begins to shift. It no longer occurs at entirely random intervals. Instead, it starts to synchronize with favorable condition. When warmth and energy align, reproduction increases. When those conditions fade, it slows. The process becomes connected to the rhythm of the planet, even if that rhythm is still incomplete. This is not a dramatic change. There are no sudden leaps, no clear turning point. It happens gradually, quietly, as if life is learning something it has never encountered before. For the first time, there is a sense of alignment between what exists and what is coming next. Life is no longer bound entirely to the present moment. It begins to move with the expectation that certain conditions will return, even if only loosely. The future, once unknowable, begins to carry a faint structure. This shift changes everything. When conditions repeat, even imperfectly, they allow systems to build upon themselves. Processes can be beyond a single moment. Energy can be stored and used more effectively. Growth can continue instead of restarting from nothing each time. Complexity begins to emerge, not suddenly, but as a natural result of repetition. Structures that would not survive in constant chaos now have a chance to persist. Interactions between organisms begin to form, guided by shared responses to the same environmental cues. Life starts to organize, and within this quiet organization, a deeper transformation unfolds. Adaptation no longer happens only in response to immediate change. It begins to follow patterns, adjusting not just to what is happening, but to what is likely to happen again. This is the beginning of something that resembles anticipation. It is not conscious, not intentional, but it is real. Behavior begins to reflect a connection between present conditions and future possibilities. The world is no longer a series of disconnected moments. It is becoming a sequence, and within that sequence, evolution finds a new path. Change accelerates, not because the environment becomes easier, but because it becomes more consistent. The pressure to adapt remains, but now it is shaped by patterns that allow improvement to carry forward. Each adjustment builds upon the last, creating a momentum that did not exist before. Instability once forced life to serve. Now, emerging stability allows it to advance. The difference is quiet, but its impact is profound. The rhythm forming within the planet is no longer just a background condition. It becomes a driving force, shaping the direction of life itself. What once seemed like a small shift in light and temperature begins to reveal itself as something far more significant. And as life continues to align with these patterns, a new question begins to emerge. If these rhythms can shape behavior so deeply, if they can guide growth, reproduction, and adaptation, then what else might they influence? What changes might they bring, not just to life, but to the planet as a whole? The answer lies beyond the organisms themselves, within the systems that surround them, systems that are beginning to move in harmony with the same emerging order. Something larger is taking shape, and life is only the beginning. The idea of seasons does not arrive fully formed. It does not appear as a complete system with clear boundaries and steady repetition. Instead, it begins as something uncertain, something that feels as though it is still searching for its shape. That search can be seen in the way the planet now moves through cycles that almost repeat. Warmth returns, but not always at the same strength or for the same length of time. Cooling follows, but it does not settle in a predictable way. Each shift carries a faint resemblance to the last, yet never fully matches it. These are not seasons as they are known today. There is no clear division between stages, no defined transitions that separate one period from another. Instead, the planet drifts between states, forming temporary phases that rise and fade without warning. There are moments when warmth lingers long enough to shape the surface in noticeable ways. Ice begins to retreat, water flows more freely, and energy spreads across regions that had once remained cold. But before this warmth can fully establish itself, it begins to fade again. Cold returns just as quietly, slipping back across the land and water without a fixed rhythm. Ice forms again, sometimes in places where it had only recently disappeared. The shift is not gradual or expected. It interrupts, reshapes, and then moves on. These early patterns behave like something unfinished. They resemble the structure of seasons, but without the stability needed to hold them in place. Each phase appears as if it might become consistent, only to dissolve before it can fully settle. And yet, within this instability there is progress. The changes are no longer entirely random. They follow faint paths, repeating just enough to suggest that something is beginning to organize itself. The system is not stable, but it is no longer without direction. The realization unfolds slowly. Seasons are not something that simply exist from the beginning. They are something that must emerge, shaped over time by the balance of forces that guide the planet. What feels natural in the present is the result of a long process that once had no clear form. The planet is learning, in its own quiet way, how to create cycles that can sustain themselves. Each incomplete pattern adds to the next, building towards something more stable. The shifts become slightly more connected, slightly more reliable, though still far from complete. And within this gradual movement there is a sense of anticipation. The system is moving towards something it has not yet reached. The patterns are fragile, easily disrupted, but they are growing stronger with time. Still, the instability has not disappeared. The balance is delicate, easily unsettled by the same forces that once dominated completely. The early forms of seasons can still collapse, still drift back into uncertainty if the alignment is lost. The progress is real, but it is not permanent. It exists within a narrow range of conditions that must be maintained. Without that balance, the patterns would fade once more, returning the planet to a state where nothing repeats. And so the world continues in this in-between state, no longer photic, but not yet ordered. It moves through cycles that almost hold, almost repeat, almost become something that life could depend on. The idea of seasons has begun, but it has not yet been completed. It exists as a possibility, something that is still forming, still discovering its own shape. And as these fragile patterns continue to develop, they begin to influence more than just the passing of time. They start to shape the environments that surround them, quietly guiding the way life interacts with the world. What begins here as an incomplete rhythm will soon extend beyond itself, reaching into systems that depend on it in ways not yet fully seen. And as this early form of order spreads, the next change is already beginning to unfold. It will quietly reshape everything that follows in ways still hidden from view. Above the shifting land and restless oceans, something else begins to change. The sky, once a place of constant uncertainty, no longer behaves as it did before. It still moves, still forms clouds, still carries storms across the surface, but its motion begins to follow a quieter kind of order. What once felt random now shows the faint outline of intention, as if the atmosphere itself is beginning to respond to the rhythms forming below. Light arrives with more consistency, and the air reacts to it. Warmth rises during these periods, causing the atmosphere to expand and shift in ways that begin to repeat. Cooler intervals follow, drawing the air back into calmer states. These changes are not perfect, but they are connected, forming sequences that link one moment to the next. Winds begin to take shape within this structure. Instead of moving without direction, they start to follow paths that can almost be traced. Air flows from one region to another in ways that reflect the patterns of warmth and cooling. The movement is still complex, still influenced by many factors, but it is no longer entirely unpredictable. Clouds form differently now. They gather where conditions favor their creation, rising in response to heat and fading as temperatures shift. Their presence begins to follow subtle cycles, appearing more often in certain regions, less in others. The sky, once filled with scattered and disconnected formations, begins to show signs of repetition. Storms, too, begin to change. They do not disappear, but they no longer appear without pattern. Instead, they emerge from the same conditions that are starting to repeat, forming in ways that reflect the growing structure of the atmosphere. What once seemed chaotic begins to resemble something that can be understood, even if only faintly. This transformation is not sudden. It unfolds slowly, carried by the same gradual changes that have shaped the planet's bull flow of light across its surface. The atmosphere does not decide to change. It responds, adjusting to the conditions that now hold more consistency. And in that response, something remarkable begins to happen. The atmosphere is no longer acting loon. Its behavior begins to awaken with the ocean's behaviour. Warm air rises from regions where light lingers, while cooler air settles where it fades. This exchange connects the sky to the surface in a continuous flow, linking systems that once operated independently. The oceans reflect this connection, releasing energy into the air and absorbing it again in a parachum that grows more defined. The land responds as well, holding warmth during certain periods and releasing it during others. Each part of the planet begins to influence the others, forming a network of interactions that move together rather than apart. The realization is quiet but profound. Stability in one part of the system begins to create stability in others. The emerging patterns of light shape the atmosphere shapes the oceans, and the oceans influence the land. What was once a collection of separate, unstable processes becomes something more unified. The planet is beginning to synchronize. This synchronization does not eliminate variation. The atmosphere still shifts, still changes, still carries complexity within its motion, but that complexity now exists within a framework that allows it to repeat, to connect, to build upon itself. The sky no longer feels like an unpredictable force acting upon the world. It becomes part of the world's rhythm, responding to it, shaping it, and being shaped in return. And as this quiet order continues to spread, its effects begin to reach further. The surface of the planet, once subject to sudden and disconnected changes, now starts to experience conditions that follow these emerging patterns. The land, the water, and the air are no longer separate systems drifting in uncertainty. They are becoming parts of a single evolving structure. And as that structure strengthens, the next transformation begins to take hold, one that will shape the surface in ways that can no longer be ignored. Beneath the shifting sky, the oceans begin to change in ways that are less visible, but far more enduring. Their surface still moves with the winds, rising and falling, in response to the air above. But deeper within, something quieter begins to form. The water no longer responds only to the moment. It begins to hold on to what it has experienced, carrying traces of warmth and energy forward through time. Light now reaches the oceans with greater consistency, and the water absorbs it, not all at once, but gradually. Heat settles into the upper layers, lingering there longer than before. It does not disappear as quickly when darkness returns. Instead, it is released slowly, softening the transitions between warmth and cooling. This simple change begins to reshape everything. The oceans become less reactive and more steady. Their behavior no longer follows only the immediate conditions of the sky. Instead, it reflects a balance between what is happening now and what has already passed. The water begins to act as a reservoir, storing energy and redistributing it over time. And with this storage comes structure. Currents begin to form, not as random flows, but as pathways shaped by differences in temperature and movement. Water travels in loops and arcs, carrying warmth from one region to another, spreading it across distances that would otherwise remain isolated. These movements are not perfectly stable, but they begin to repeat, following patterns that grow more defined with each cycle. Temperature itself starts to organize. Layers form within the ocean, separating warmer water above from cooler depths below. These layers shift, but they do so in ways that can be traced, creating a vertical structure that did not exist before. The ocean is no longer a single uniform body. It becomes something more complex, more ordered. Within this structure, nutrients begin to move differently. Instead of being scattered unpredictably, they circulate along with the currents, rising and falling in ways that connect different regions of the ocean. Areas of growth begin to emerge where conditions allow, sustained by the steady movement of energy and material. The oceans begin to support continuity. What once changed without warning now follows a rhythm that extends beyond a single moment. Conditions can persist long enough for processes to develop, for interactions to strengthen, for systems to build upon themselves. And in this quiet transformation, a deeper role reveals itself. The oceans begin to moderate the planet. They soften extremes, absorbing excess warmth and releasing it slowly, preventing sudden shifts from becoming overwhelming. They act as a buffer, smoothing the irregularities that still exist in the atmosphere and the planet's tilt. The effect is subtle but powerful. The world becomes more stable, not because the forces shaping it have disappeared, but because the oceans help to balance them. This balance does not come from a single change. It emerges from the interaction of many systems working together. The light that reaches the surface, the atmosphere that moves above it, and the oceans that hold and distribute energy all begin to align. The planet starts to regulate itself. This regulation is not perfect. Variations remain, and the system is still evolving. But the presence of these connections creates a foundation for stability that did not exist before. The oceans, in their quiet and continuous motion, become something more than a passive part of the planet. They become a memory, holding on to the past and shaping the future through the way they move and respond. And as this memory strengthens, its influence begins to extend outward. The land, once subject to sudden and unpredictable changes, now starts to experience conditions that are more consistent. Life, already adapting to emerging patterns, begins to find a world that holds those patterns for longer. The balance is not complete, but it is growing. And as the oceans continue to carry and distribute this stability, the next transformation begins to take shape, one that will connect these patterns to the living systems. As the oceans begin to hold memory and the atmosphere settles into quieter patterns, life finds itself in a world that no longer changes without connection. The shifts are still present, but they now follow paths that repeat just enough to be followed, just enough to be shared. At first, the change appears within small clusters. Groups of organisms begin to exist within the same space, not simply by chance, but because the conditions that support them now persist long enough to overlap. Where energy gathers, life gathers. Where nutrients flow, life remains. These clusters do not form with intention. They emerge naturally, shaped by the patterns of the environment. One form of life thrives where light is strongest, drawing energy from it. Another follows, feeding on what is produced. A third responds to the changes that both create, adapting to the presence of the others. What begins as coincidence slowly becomes connection. Feeding cycles start to align. Growth no longer happens in isolation, but in response to the presence of others. When one increases, another follows. When conditions shift, the response moves through the group, not as a single reaction, but as a chain of adjustments. The world begins to echo itself, not just through light and temperature, but through life. These interactions grow more structured over time. The same conditions return often enough for relationships to strengthen. Organisms begin to rely on one another in subtle ways, their existence becoming linked through shared patterns. The environment shapes them, and in turn, they begin to shape the environment. This is something new. Life is no longer simply enduring the world as it changes. It is beginning to organize within it. The presence of repetition allows connections to form, and those connections begin to create systems that extend beyond individual survival. The realization unfolds quietly. An ecosystem cannot exist without rhythm. It depends on patterns that reciprocate, that recession enough to support relationships over time. Without that repetition, these connections would dissolve before they could take hold. Here, at the edge of stability, those connections begin to persist. The oceans carry nutrients in cycles that can now be followed. The atmosphere delivers changes that are no longer entirely unpredictable. The land, though still shifting, holds conditions long enough for life to respond and adapt together. Each part of the system begins to align with the others. The clusters grow more complex. Interactions deepen. What was once a loose gathering of life becomes something more integrated, more dependent on the balance that surrounds it. The presence of one form begins to influence the survival of another. creating a network that extends outward. This network is fragile, but it is real, and within it, a quiet transformation takes place. Life begins to depend on the patterns that shape it. The rhythms of light, temperature, and movement are no longer just influences. They become foundations, something that life builds upon and cannot easily exist without. The shift is profound, even if it remains unseen. For the first time, the planet supports systems that are larger than any single organism. These systems hold together through repetition, through the continued presence of conditions that allow them to function as a whole. The world is no longer a place of isolated survival. It is becoming a place of interaction, of connection, of shared existence. And yet this balance remains delicate. The patterns that support these early ecosystems are still forming, still incomplete. A disruption in rhythm could weaken the connections that are only just beginning to stabilize. The system is growing, but it is not yet secure. Still, the direction is clear. Life is organizing, not by design, but through the influence of a world that is beginning to repetise. The foundation of something larger has been set, something that will continue to expand as the planet moves closer to true stability. And as these early ecosystems take shape, a deeper transformation begins to approach, one that will define the rhythms they depend on with greater clarity. The seasons themselves are still forming, but their influence is already being felt. There is no single moment when the change becomes visible. The planet does not stop, pause, or announce that it has reached a new state. It continues its motion as it always has, turning quietly through space, carrying oceans, land and atmosphere, within a system that has never truly been still. And yet, within that motion, something has settled. The tilt that once wandered now holds itself within a narrower path. It still moves, still shifts slightly, but the wide, uncertain swings are gone. The motion has become restrained, guided into a range that allows the planet to return again and again to nearly the same position. It is not perfect, it does not need to be. What matters is that it repeats. Light now reaches the surface in ways that follow a recognizable pattern. Regions of the planet experience warmth and cooling in sequences that connect across time. The transitions are no longer abrupt or disconnected. They form a flow, a gradual movement from one state to another, then back again. This is balance. Not a fixed condition, not a state of stillness, but a consistency within motion. The forces that once pulled the planet into uncertainty are still present, still active. But they now interact in a way that limits their extremes. Each influence is held in check by another, creating a system that remains dynamic while no longer drifting into chaos. The change has taken place over immense stretches of time. It was built through countless small adjustments, each one shaping the next. No single event created this balance. It emerged slowly, almost invisibly, as the system moved toward alignment. And because it happened so gradually, it feels as though it has always been this way. But it has not. The difference lies in what the planet can now sustain. Patterns that once appeared briefly and vanished now return with enough consistency to be relied upon. Warm periods extend across regions in ways that can be anticipated. Cooler intervals follow with a structure that no longer collapses without warning. The foundation of something familiar has formed. What we would come to recognize as seasons now exists, not in their final form, but in a state that holds together. The sequence of change, warmth building, then fading, cold emerging, then retreating, has become stable enough to repeat. This repetition carries weight. It allows the planet to move through time with a rhythm that can be followed. It creates a framework within which processes can develop, extend, and connect. The world is no longer defined by isolated moments, but by sequences that carry meaning from one cycle to the next. And within this structure, the past begins to give way to something new. The chaos that once shaped every aspect of the planet has not disappeared, but it no longer dominates. It has been contained, balanced by the forces that now guide the system into consistency. The instability has been refined into variation within a stable range. The result is not a perfect world, but a reliable one. The significance of this shift is quiet, almost hidden beneath the steady motion of the planet. There is no visible marker, that separates what came before from what exists now. And yet everything has changed. The Earth has entered a new phase. It is a phase where time can be measured not just by movement but by repetition, where patterns are not temporary but sustained, where the world begins to offer something it never could before, a sense of continuity. And with that continuity comes possibility. Life, which has been adapting to fragments of rhythm, now encounters a world where those rhythms hold. The conditions that shape existence can now be expected, not perfectly, but reliably enough to influence behavior in deeper ways. The balance has been found not as an end point, but as a beginning. And as the planet continues its steady motion, this newfound stability begins to extend beyond itself, reaching into the systems that depend on it. What follows will not simply be survival within a stable world, but transformation guided by it. The change is not loud, but it reaches deeper than anything before it. With the planet now holding a steady rhythm, life begins to experience something it has never truly known. The patterns of light and temperature no longer appear as brief opportunities that vanish without warning. They return often enough to be followed, often enough to be trusted, and in that trust, something new begins to emerge. Life starts to move differently. Where once energy was taken only in the moment, it is now gathered and held. Organisms begin to store what they can, keeping it for times when conditions are less favorable. This simple act marks a profound shift. It means that the present is no longer the only time that matters. What exists now can be carried forward into what comes next. Growth begins to follow a trend. Instead of starting and stopping without connection, it aligns with periods of warmth and light. Development trees across cycles continue where it left off rather than beginning again from nothing. The process becomes smoother, more efficient, shaped by the predictability of the environment. Reproduction changes as well. It begins to occur in phases that match favorable conditions. Life does not expand randomly, but in response to the times when survival is most likely. This alignment strengthens the chances of continuation, weighting the success of one generation to the patterns of the world around it. And then, something even more complex begins to form. Movement enters the system. Life no longer remains in place. Some forms begin to shift their position, not randomly, but in response to changing conditions. As warmth moves across regions, adhesion's resources gain fate. These movements are small at first, simple adjustments, but they carry a deeper meaning so guessed awareness of change over time. Migration, in its earliest form, begins to appear, not as a conscious decision, but as a response to patterns that repeat often enough to guide behavior. Life starts to follow the rhythm of the planet, moving with it rather than simply enduring it. This is where the transformation becomes undeniable. The presence of stable cycles introduces something that chaos never allowed. The concept of a future. It is not understood, not imagined, but it is built into the behavior of living systems. Actions are no longer tied only to the present moment. They are shaped by what is likely to come, and in that shift, life becomes something more than reactive. It begins to anticipate. This anticipation does not require thought. It emerges naturally from repetition. When conditions return again and again, behavior adjusts to match them. The world becomes something that can be followed, something that carries a structure that life can align with. The implications of this change are vast. Seasons are no longer just patterns of temperature and light. They become frameworks within which life organizes itself. They define when to grow, when to rest, when to expand, and when to conserve. They create a rhythm that life depends on not just for survival, but for progression. And within that progression, complexity begins to rise. Structures that require continuity can now develop. Interactions that depend on timing can now stabilize. Systems that build over time can now persist. The presence of a predictable environment allows life to extend itself beyond the limits of immediate reaction. The world begins to support memory, not in the way it is understood in thinking beings, but as a continuity of behavior across time. What works in one cycle is carried into the next. What fails is adjusted. Life begins to refine itself, guided by the patterns that now shape its existence. And in that refinement, a deeper transformation takes hold. The seeds of strategy begin to form, not as deliberate planning, but as behavior that aligns with expected conditions. Life begins to act in ways that prepare for what is coming, even if it does not understand why. The environment provides the structure, and life responds by adapting within it. This is the beginning of something that will continue to grow, something that will eventually lead to forms of life capable of understanding. But here, in this early moment, it remains simple, quiet, almost hidden. It changes everything. The planet's balance, and now life begins to move within that balance in ways that were never possible before. And as these patterns continue to guide behavior, they begin to darken, not just how life. It is easy to believe that what repeats will always repeat. The light returns, the warmth follows, the cold set. Again, then. The sequence feels dependable, almost permanent, as though the world has finally decided how it will behave and has no reason to change. The rhythm is steady enough to trust, familiar enough to feel unbreakable, but that sense of permanence is only an impression. The patterns that now shape the planet are not fixed in place. They are held together by a balance of forces that continue to move, continue to adjust. Even when their effects are not immediately visible, the Earth has found a way to stabilize itself. But that stability is not absolute. It is maintained. The tilt that guides the seasons still shifts, though within limits that now feel predictable. The forces that influence it, the quiet pull of distant bodies, the energy from the sun, the internal motion of the planet itself have not disappeared. They remain present, still shaping the system in subtle ways. What has changed is not the existence of these forces, but the way they interact. They now align closely enough to create consistency. Their variations remain small, contained within a range that allows patterns to repeat. But that alignment is not permanent. It is the result of conditions that can over time shift again. This is the part that is rarely noticed. The world feels stable because change happens slowly, far beyond the scale of a single moment, or even a lifetime. The cycles repeat so consistently that they appear unchanging, creating the illusion that they have always been this way, and always will be. But the memory of chaos still exists within the system. The same forces that once caused the planet to drift into unpredictability have not been removed. They are still active, still capable of influencing the balance. They are simply held in a state where their effects remain limited, and that limitation depends on the continued alignment of everything involved. The oceans still move, carrying energy across the planet. The atmosphere still shifts, redistributing warmth and motion. The planet still turns, still leans, still adjusts. Every part of the system is in motion, even as it appears steady. The balance is not a resting state. It is an ongoing process, and within that process there is always the possibility of change. Not sudden, not immediate, but gradual. A shift in alignment, a variation in movement, a slow, if diff, in the forces that hold everything together. Over time, these changes can accumulate, altering the balance that once seemed so secure. The realization is quiet, but it carries weight. The seasons are not guaranteed. They are the result of a system that currently holds itself together. They exist because the conditions that support them remain in place, not because they are fixed beyond change. What feels permanent is in truth sustained. This does not make the world unstable in the present moment. The patterns are strong, the cycles reliable, the balance real. But it does change the way that stability is understood. It is not something the planet has achieved once and for all. It is something the planet continues to maintain, moment by moment, through the interaction of forces that never fully stop moving. The comfort of repetition remains, but beneath it lies a deeper awareness. The we experience is not a final state. It is part of an ongoing process, shaped by conditions that can evolve with. The stability we trust is real, but it is also temporary in ways that are not immediately visible. And as this understanding settles in, the story begins to open once again. If the balance can be maintained, it can also be halted. If stability emerged from chaos once before, it is not impossible for the system to move again, slowly, quietly, towards something different. The question is no longer whether the planet can change, but how those changes might unfold, and what they might mean for the fiends that now define the world. The answer does not arrive yet, but the possibility remains. The rhythm holds. What was once fragile now carries a quiet strength, repeating with enough consistency that the planet begins to feel different. The cycles of light and temperature no longer drift or collapse. They return again and again, shaping the surface in ways that can be recognized, not just felt. For the first time, the idea of place begins to take form. Regions of the planet no longer exist as temporary states that change without warning. They begin to settle into identities shaped by the patterns that now repeat. Areas that receive more consistent warmth begin to hold that warmth, not perfectly, but reliably enough to define them. Other regions remain cooler, touched by light in ways that follow a different rhythm. The surface begins to divide. These divisions are not marked by lines, but by behavior. One area responds to the cycle of light with steady warmth, another with prolonged cooling. Some regions experience variation, but within a range that repeats. The world begins to organize itself into zones, each one shaped by the patterns that now persist. The oceans reflect this change as well. Their movements, once broad and uncertain, now follow paths that reinforce these differences. Warm currents travel through certain regions, carrying energy that supports stable conditions. Cooler waters settle elsewhere, creating contrast that remains consistent over time. The land responds in quiet agreement. Surfaces that hold heat begin to dry, forming areas where moisture does not remain for long. Other regions, shaped by the flow of water and the cycles of temperature, retain conditions that support growth. These changes are not sudden. They emerge slowly, guided by the repetition that now defines the planet. The result is something entirely new. The world becomes recognizable. Not in the way it is known today, but in the sense that it begins to hold form. The surface is no longer shifting endlessly between states. It begins to stabilize into patterns that give each region a character, a behavior that can be expected, even if only within a certain range. Warm zones, cooler regions, areas of transition, these distinctions begin to persist. And with persistence comes structure. The realization unfolds quietly. Stability does not only shape time, it shapes space. The repetition of cycles creates differences across the planet that remain long enough to define them. Geography, in its earliest form, begins to emerge from the rhythm of the world. This changes how the planet behaves. The atmosphere moves in response to these differences, carrying air between regions in patterns that reflect the structure below. The oceans circulate in ways that reinforce the separation of conditions. Each system begins to align with the others, strengthening the divisions that are forming. The planet becomes organized. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to create a sense of place that did not exist before. The surface is no longer a shifting. It is becoming a landscape shaped by the repetition of time. And within this scape, something else begins to change. Life, which has already begun to align with the planet's rhythms, now encounters environments that remain consistent long enough to influence its development in deeper ways. Conditions no longer change so quickly that adaptation must remain general. They hold steady long enough for life to respond more precisely. The world is offering something new. It is offering stability not just in time but in location, and with that stability comes opportunity. Each region, defined by its own pattern, begins to create conditions that favor certain forms of life over others. The differences that are emerging across the planet are no longer temporary. They are becoming part of the structure of the world itself. The transformation is quiet, but its impact is profound. The Earth is no longer just a system of cycles. It is becoming a collection of places, each shaped by those cycles in its own way. And as these places continue to stabilize, the next step begins to unfold. Life will no longer adapt only to the rhythm of time. It will begin to adapt to the character of place. As the world settles into recognizable places, life begins to respond in a way it never could before. The patterns of warmth, light, and movement no longer shift beyond recognition. They hold long enough for life to adjust with precision. What once required constant flexibility now allows something more focused to emerge. Life begins to find its place. In regions where warmth remains consistent, certain forms begin to thrive. They grow steadily, shaped by conditions that no longer disappear without warning. Their structures become more refined, tuned to the environment that now supports them. They do not need to prepare for sudden extremes in the same way. Instead, they adapt to the conditions that return again and again. In cooler regions, different forms take hold. These organisms respond to cycles that favor lower energy, slower growth, and different patterns. They are not less adapted, only adapted differently, shaped by a rhythm that contrasts with the warmth found elsewhere. The separation of environments begins to guide the separation of life. Where once a single form might have struggled to survive everywhere, now multiple forms begin to specialize, each suited to the conditions of its region. Life no longer spreads evenly across the planet. It begins to organize, distributing itself according to the patterns that define each place. This is not a random process. It follows from the stability that now exists. As conditions repeat, behaviors become more precise. Organisms refine how they gather energy, how they grow, how they interact with their surroundings. Each adjustment builds upon the last, creating forms that are increasingly suited to their specific environment. The change is quiet, but it carries depth. Life is no longer just surviving, or even anticipating. It is beginning to optimize. Structures become more efficient. Processes align more closely with the rhythms that shape them. Growth happens at the right time, in the right conditions with fewer interruptions. Energy is used more effectively, no longer wasted in constant adjustment to unpredictable change. And with this efficiency comes diversity. Different environments encourage different adaptations. Each region begins to host its own forms of life, each one shaped by the unique patterns that define that place. The planet becomes more varied, not just in its geography, but in the life it supports. These differences do not exist in isolation. Within each region, interactions deepen. Life forms begin to depend on one another in more specific ways. One provides what another requires. One responds to changes that another creates. The connections that once formed loosely now strengthen, becoming more structured and more reliable. The ecosystems that began as fragile networks now grow more complex. Each organism takes on a role, not assigned, but shaped by the conditions it inhabits. These roles fit together, forming systems that function with increasing coordination. The presence of one supports the presence of another, creating a balance that extends beyond individual survival. The world begins to feel organized, not just in its physical structure, but in the life that fills it. And within that organization, something deeper emerges, the balance. That allows this complexity is powerful, but it also creates dependence. Each role, each connection, each adaptation relies on the stability that made it possible. The more refined life becomes, the more it depends on the patterns that shape it. The realization unfolds slowly. Strength and vulnerability begin to exist together. The same stability that allows life to thrive also ties it closely to the conditions that sustain it. Changes that once required only general adaptation now have the potential to disrupt entire systems. The more connected life becomes, the more it relies on the balance that holds those connections in place. For now, that balance remains. The world continues to support the growing complexity of life, allowing it to expand, refine, and organize itself in ways that were once impossible. The roles continue to form, the systems continue to strengthen, and the planet moves further into a state of structured existence. But beneath that structure, a quiet question begins to take shape. If life has become so closely aligned with stability, what happens if that stability begins to shift again? The calm that settles over the planet feels complete. Patterns repeat with quiet reliability. Warmth rises and fades, cold returns and retreats, and the systems of life move in alignment with cycles that now seem dependable. The world appears stable, organized and whole, as though it has reached a state that no longer needs to change. But beneath that calm, something less visible begins to take shape. The stability that now supports life also begins to shape it more narrowly. As conditions repeat, life becomes more refined in how it responds. Each organism adjusts itself to fit the patterns it experiences, aligning more closely with the rhythms that define its environment. This refinement brings strength. It allows life to function with greater efficiency, to grow and interact in ways that were not possible before. But it also brings something else. It brings dependence. Life begins to rely on the patterns that now surround it. The timing of growth, the movement of energy, the cycles of reproduction all become tied to conditions that are expected to return. The connection between life and environment deepens, becoming more precise, more integrated. And with that precision comes a quiet limitation. The flexibility that once defined survival begins to fade. In a world of constant change, life had no choice but to remain adaptable, ready to respond to whatever conditions appeared. Now, in a world of repeating patterns, that need begins to lessen. Adaptation becomes focused rather than broad. Organisms specialize, tuning themselves to the conditions they know. They become highly suited to their environment, but less prepared for anything outside it. The shift is gradual, almost unnoticeable. Life grows stronger within its place, but less capable beyond it. This is where the tension begins. The same stability that allows ecosystems to flourish also binds them to the conditions that sustain them. Each connection, each role, each finely tuned behavior depends on the continued presence of patterns that remain consistent. If those patterns hold, the system thrives. If they change, even slightly, the effects can ripple out. A shift in temperature, a change in the timing of light, a disruption in the flow of energy. These do not need to be extreme to have an impact. Because life has become so closely aligned with its environment, even small changes can create imbalance. What once would have been absorbed through flexibility now has the potential to disrupt entire systems. The realization is subtle, but it carries weight. Chaos once forced life to adapt constantly, keeping it open to change. Stability, in contrast, allows life to settle, to refine itself within a narrower range of conditions. It creates efficiency, but it also reduces the need for broad adaptability. Strength and vulnerability begin to exist together. The more ordered the system becomes, the more it depends on that order remaining intact. The balance that supports life is not just a foundation, it is a requirement. And yet the forces that shape the planet have not stopped moving. The tilt still shifts, even if only slightly. The atmosphere still adjusts. The oceans still circulate, carrying energy across the globe. Everything remains in motion even as it appears stable. The balance holds, but it is not fixed. It is maintained through the continued interaction of forces that never fully settle, and within that interaction lies the possibility of change. Not immediate, not sudden, but present. The world that now feels secure carries within it the same dynamics that once created instability. They are quieter now, more controlled, but they have not disappeared. The question begins to emerge slowly, almost unnoticed. If the balance that sustains life can be disrupted, even in small ways, what would happen to the systems that depend on it so completely? The answer does not reveal itself yet. But the possibility lingers just beneath the surface of a world that appears perfectly at ease. And as that possibility grows clearer, the story begins to turn once again, moving toward moments when the balance was tested, when the stability of the planet was not as certain as it now seems. The rhythm holds, but it is not as unbroken as it seems. Beneath the steady return of light and the familiar progression of seasons, there are moments when the pattern shifts almost imperceptibly. The changes are small, often unnoticed, yet they carry a quiet reminder of what the planet once was. The balance that now defines the world has not always remained perfectly aligned. There have been times when the tilt has moved beyond its usual range, not dramatically, but enough to alter the way light reaches the surface. These shifts do not stop the cycles entirely, but they stretch them, compress them, changing their timing in ways that ripple across the planet. Warm periods linger longer than expected. Cooler intervals arrive sooner or hold their presence just a little too strongly. The rhythm remains, but it begins to drift at the edges, as though something beneath it is adjusting. The atmosphere reflects these changes in subtle ways. Patterns of wind shift slightly, redirecting movement across regions that had grown accustomed to consistency. Clouds form differently, appearing in places where they had not before or failing to gather where they once did. The oceans respond as well, though their changes are slower, carried through currents that shift direction over time. Warm water travels along new paths, altering the balance of energy across the surface. Cooler waters rise in unexpected regions, reshaping the conditions that life has come to depend on. None of these changes appear sudden or dramatic. They unfold quietly, over long stretches of time, blending into the existing patterns so seamlessly that they are difficult to separate from them. The world continues to feel stable, even as its balance adjusts beneath the surface. And yet within these adjustments, something becomes clear. The stability of the planet is not fixed. It is not locked into place by an unchanging system. It is held together through a constant process of interaction, where forces continue to move and influence one another, even when their effects are subtle. The memory of chaos remains within this process. The same forces that once pulled the planet into unpredictability are still present. They have not been removed, only balanced. Their influence is contained but not eliminated, and from time to time that influence becomes visual again, not as disrupt, but as variation. These moments are not failures of the system. They are part of it. They show that the balance is active, maintained through continuous adjustment rather than permanent stability. The planet does not rest in a fixed state. It moves within a range, guided by forces that never fully settle. This realization introduces a quiet unease. The world that feels stable is not immune to change. It is sustained through conditions that can shift, even if only gradually. The patterns that define it are strong, but they are not absolute. What appears constant is, in truth, maintained. And within that maintenance lies the possibility of variation. The echoes of the planet's earlier instability are not gone. They remain within the system, expressed through these subtle shifts, these quiet adjustments that remind us of a time when balance had not yet been found. The difference now is that these changes occur within limits. They do not return the world to chaos, but they reveal that chaos is not entirely absent. It exists beneath the surface, held in place by the same forces that once allowed it to spread. The question begins to form, not loudly, but with growing clarity. If these echoes can still appear, if the balance can still shift, even slightly, what happens when those shifts become more pronounced? How does life, now deeply connected to stability, respond when the patterns it depends on begin to change? The answer lies not in the planet alone, but in the systems that live within it. And as these quiet variations continue, the story begins to move toward those systems, toward the ways in which life reacts when the balance it depends on begins to move. At first, the changes are almost too small to notice. The seasons still arrive, the light still shifts, and the world continues its familiar rhythm. But something begins to drift within that rhythm, something subtle enough to pass unnoticed at first, yet persistent enough to alter what follows. Warm periods stretch just a little shorter than before. The rise of temperature feels incomplete, as though it does not fully reach what it once did. The light returns, but not with the same strength or duration. It fades sooner, leaving less time for the processes that depend on it. Cold follows more quickly. Cooler intervals begin to linger, extending themselves beyond their expected boundaries. The change is not dramatic, but it is enough to shift the balance. The timing that once held steady begins to slip, creating a gap between what is expected and what actually arrives. The world does not stop repeating, but its repetition becomes uneven. These shifts ripple outward through the planet. In the oceans, energy moves differently. Warmer waters that once spread across certain regions now retreat earlier, altering the flow of currents. Cooler waters rise sooner, changing the balance of conditions that life has come to rely on. The patterns still exist, but they no longer align perfectly with what they once supported. The atmosphere reflects this change as well. Winds carry different temperatures than before, moving warmth and cold in ways that no longer match the established rhythm. Clouds gather at unexpected times or fail to form when they are needed. The sky still moves, but its movement has lost some of its predictability, and life begins to feel it. The organisms that have grown within this stable system now respond to conditions that no longer arrive as expected. Growth begins, but the warmth it depends on fades too soon. Reproduction aligns with patterns that no longer hold, leaving cycles incomplete. The change is not immediate failure, it is misalignment. Processes that once flowed together begin to fall out of step. The connections that defined ecosystems start to weaken, not because they disappear, but because they no longer match the timing that holds them together. Movement follows this disruption. Life that once moved in response to predictable changes now encounters uncertainty. Migration patterns begin to falter as the conditions that guided them just enough to create confusion. The signals remain, but they no longer lead to the same outcomes. The world has not returned to A, because no longer fully apelai. This is where the tension deepens. Life, once shaped by constant instability, adapted to vive in any condition. But over time, as stability took hold, it refined itself, aligning closely with the patterns that defined its environment. That refinement brought strength, but it also brought dependence. Now, as those patterns begin to slip, life finds itself less prepared for change than it once was. The same stability that allowed ecosystems to flourish has made them more sensitive to disruption. Small variations now carry larger consequences because the system depends on precise timing and balance. The realization is quiet but unsettling. The world that taught life to trust its rhythms is now shifting those rhythms, not completely, but enough to create uncertainty. The difference between expectation and reality begins to grow, and within that difference, strain begins to appear. And still, the planet continues its motion. The cycles have not disappeared. They have only changed, drifting slightly from the patterns that once defined them. The balance is still present, but it is no longer as exact, no longer as steady as it once seemed. The question begins to take shape. If these patterns can slip even slightly, can they be restored? Can the system return to the balance that once held everything together? The answer lies not in the change itself, but in the way the planet responds to it. And as the strain continues to build, the story begins to move toward that response, toward the quiet processes that may yet bring the world back into alignment. The imbalance does not remain. Though the patterns begin to slip and the rhythms lose their precision, the planet does not move endlessly away from stability. Instead, something quieter begins to take place, something that unfolds slowly, almost beyond the scale of notice. The forces that shape the world continue their motion, but now they begin to interact in ways that guide the system back toward alignment. The tilt, which had drifted slightly beyond its usual range, begins to settle again. Not suddenly, not through any single correction, but through a gradual narrowing of variation. The movement remains, but it becomes more contained, guided back into a range where patterns can hold. Light follows this adjustment. The distribution of warmth across the surface begins to return to a more familiar sequence. Regions that had experienced shortened periods of energy now find those intervals extending once more. Cooler phases retreat slightly, allowing the balance between states to re-establish itself. The change is subtle, but it carries direction. The atmosphere responds in quiet agreement. Winds that had shifted begin to realign, following paths that reflect the returning structure of temperature and light. Cloud formation becomes more consistent again, gathering where conditions favor it and dispersing when they no longer do. Storms, too, begin to follow patterns that resemble what existed before. The oceans move more slowly, but their role is just as important. The currents that had adjusted begin to shift once again, redistributing energy in ways that support the returning balance. Warm waters travel along paths that reinforce stability, while cooler waters settle into patterns that no longer dissuspend. These movements do not occur in isolation. Each system influences the others. The atmosphere responds to the oceans respond to the tilt, and the tilt itself is shaped by forces beyond the planet. Together, they form a network that continues to adjust, seeking a state where variation remains within limits that allow consistency to return. The recovery is not perfect, but it is effective. The patterns that had begun to slip now strengthen again. Warmth and cooling regain their connection. The cycles that define the planet begin to hold more firmly, re-establishing the rhythm that life depends on. This process takes time. It unfolds over periods so long that no single moment reveals its progress. There is no clear point where the imbalance ends and the stability returns. Instead, There is only a gradual shift, a movement toward alignment that becomes visible only when viewed across the span of many cycles. And within this quiet recovery, a deeper realization begins to form. The planet is not passive. It does not simply experience change without response. It adjusts not through intention, but through the continuous interaction of its systems. The forces that shape it do not act independently. They respond to one another, creating asymmetric balance that can shift, but also return. Instability, in this sense, is not an end. It is part of the process. When the system does not collapse immediately, it moves, adjusts, and seeks a new alignment. The same complexity that allows for variation also allows for correction. The world carries within it the ability to recover. This does not mean that balance is guaranteed, nor that every disruption will resolve in the same way. The system remains delicate, influenced by forces that continue to move and interact. But it does show that stability is not easily lost. It can be restored. The tension that once built beneath the slipping patterns begins to ease. The rhythms return not identical to what they were, but close enough to support the systems that depend on them. Life begins to align once more, finding its place within the renewed structure, and as the planet continues its motion, the balance holds again. Not as something permanent, but as something sustained. And with that understanding, the story begins to turn once more. The world that exists now is shaped by this ability to adjust, to recover, to maintain its firm even as it continues to change. The question that follows is no longer about whether balance can return, but how it continues to shape the present and what it might mean for the future that has yet to unfold. The world feels certain. The light returns each day, rising over the horizon with a familiarity that rarely invites doubt. Warmth follows its expected path, building into seasons that arrive in an order so consistent it feels permanent. Spring gives way to summer, summer fades into cooler air, and the cycle continues without interruption. This repetition creates a sense of trust. The patterns are so reliable that they seem fixed, as though the planet has settled into a final state, one that no longer needs to change. The passing of time feels structured, measured by cycles that appear unbreakable. The world feels complete, as if it has always been this way, and will continue without deviation, but that certainty is only an impression. Beneath the steady rhythm lies a system that is still in motion. The patterns that define the present are not held in place by stillness, but by continuous interaction. The Earth does not rest in a perfect balance. It maintains one. The tilt that shapes the seasons still shifts, though within limits that feel stable. The orbit continues its path, guided by forces that never stop acting upon it. The atmosphere moves, the oceans circulate, and energy flows across the surface in ways that are always adjusting. Nothing is truly fixed. The stability that defines the present is the result of countless forces aligning closely enough to create consistency. They do not cancel one another out completely. They move together, influencing each other in ways that keep variation within a range that allows patterns to replicate. The world appears steady because these changes are small. They unfold slowly on the scale of IMD per se. A shift in timing, a variation in temperature, a change in movement, each one occurs gradually, blending into the larger system without drawing attention to itself. The result is a sense of permanence. But permanence in this case is not a true state. It is the effect of change happening quietly. The realization begins to take shape. The cycles that define the planet are not guaranteed. They are sustained through the continued alignment of forces that remain in motion. The balance that creates them is not locked into place. It is maintained moment by moment through interactions that never fully stop. What feels stable is, in truth, dynamic. The difference between these two states is subtle but important. A fixed system does not change. A dynamic system does, but in ways that remain within limits. The Earth exists in the latter, holding its patterns not because they cannot shift, but because they have not yet shifted beyond a certain range. And within that understanding, something deeper becomes clear. The world we experience is not the end of a process. It is a moment within it. The forces that once shaped chaos still exist, still acting beneath the surface of the present. They are balanced now, but they are not gone. Their influence remains, contained within a system that currently holds together. The illusion of perfection begins to fade. The patterns remain, the cycles continue, but they are seen differently now, not as permanent features of the planet, but as outcomes of a balance that is still active, still adjusting, still capable of change. This does not make the world unstable, it makes it alive. The rhythm that defines the present is not the result of a completed system, but of one that continues to move, to respond, to maintain itself through constant interaction. The stability we trust is real, but it is not absolute. It exists because change has not yet moved beyond the limits that hold it in place. And as that realization settles in, the focus begins to shift. The world is maintained rather than fixed. Then the forces that say it in more important than ever. Understanding the present means understanding what continues to shape it, even when those influences remain unseen. The story moves deeper, toward those forces, toward the quiet interactions that keep the planet balanced, and toward the ways they continue to guide the rhythm of the world. The balance that shapes the world does not exist on its own. It is held in place by forces that continue to move, to interact, and to influence the planet in ways that are rarely noticed. The patterns that feel so familiar, the rise and fall of seasons, the steady return of light, are not the result of a completed system. They are the outcome of relationships that remain active. Even now, the planet is one of these forces. It leans quietly at an angle that allows light to fall unevenly across the surface, creating the variation that defines the seasons. This angle feels constant, but it is not fixed. It shifts slowly over time, moving within a range that currently supports stability. The movement is small, almost imperceptible, yet it never fully stops. The orbit carries the planet around the Sun in a path that feels smooth and predictable. Each return marks the passing of a cycle, reinforcing the rhythm that life depends on. But this path is not perfectly unchanging. It stretches and contracts slightly, altering the distance between the planet and the source of its energy. The Sun itself remains a constant presence, yet its influence is not entirely uniform. The energy it provides fluctuates in subtle ways, changing the intensity of light and warmth that reaches the planet. These variations are small, but they are part of the system, contributing to the delicate balance that defines the present. And then there is the Moon. It moves alongside the planet, its presence so familiar that it often feels separate from the processes that shape the Earth. But its influence is woven deeply into the system. It steadies the tilt, limiting the range of its movement and helping to maintain the consistency of the seasons. Without it, the balance would be far less stable, the variations far greater. Together, these forces form a network of interaction. They do not act independently. Each one influences the others, creating a system that is constantly adjusting, constantly responding. The tilt affects how light is distributed. The orbit shapes the timing of that light. The Sun provides the energy, and the Moon helps to steady the system as a whole. The result is the world we experience. But that result is not permanent. The realization begins to unfold. The forces that once created instability have not disappeared. They are still present, still active, still capable of influencing the planet in ways that could alter its balance. What has changed is the way they interact, the way their effects are contained within limits that allow stability to exist. The past is not separate from the present. It continues, carried forward through the same forces that shaped the early world. The chaos that once defined the planet has not been erased. It has been transformed, refined into variation within a system that now holds together. This transformation is not final. It is part of an ongoing process. The balance that exists today depends on the continued alignment of these forces. As long as they remain within a certain range, the patterns will hold. But if those relationships shift, even gradually, the system could begin to change again. The thought is quiet, but it carries weight. The world is stable, but not guaranteed. The cycles that define it are supported by conditions that continue to move, to adjust, to evolve. The forces that sustain the present are the same forces that once shaped the past. and they remain capable of shaping the future. This continuity changes how the world is understood. It is not a finished system, but a living one, shaped by interactions that never fully settle. The patterns we trust are part of a larger process, one that extends beyond the present moment and continues to unfold. And within that unfolding, a question begins to form. If the same forces remain, if the balance depends on their alignment, could the system ever shift again? Could the world return even partially to a state where its patterns are less certain, less stable? The answer does not arrive yet, but the possibility remains, waiting quietly within the forces that continue to shape the planet. The rhythm continues, but it does not promise to remain unchanged. The cycles that define the world feel steady, repeating with a familiarity that suggests permanence. Yet beneath that repetition lies a truth that has been present from the beginning. The balance that holds these patterns together is not fixed. It is part of a system that continues to move, to adjust, to evolve. The future of the seasons is not written in place. The tilt of the planet still shifts slowly, almost beyond notice. The orbit continues its path, influenced by forces that never fully settle. The energy from the sun rises and falls in subtle variations. The moon maintains its influence. But even that presence is part of a larger interaction that is never entirely still. These movements are small. They unfold across spans of time so long that they rarely draw attention. But they accumulate. Each variation, each adjustment, adds to a process that never truly stops. The patterns we rely on are held within a range, but that range itself can change. The realization begins to take shape. The seasons exist because conditions currently allow them to exist. They are not guaranteed. They are sustained by a balance that remains active, not completed. This does not mean that change will come suddenly. It does not suggest a return to the chaos of the earliest world. The system is stable, supported by forces that hold it within limits that have endured for immense periods of time. But stability does not mean permanence. It means consistency within a range that can still shift. The future may not look identical to the present. Warm periods may lengthen or shorten. Cooler intervals may arrive with slight variation. The timing that feels so precise may begin to drift, not enough to break the pattern entirely, but enough to alter its form. These changes would not erase the seasons, but they could reshape them, and those changes may already be unfolding. Not as something dramatic, not as a visible transformation, but as part of the ongoing motion of the system. The forces that shape the planet do not pause. They continue carrying the world forward through adjustments that are often too gradual to perceive. The difference between what is and what will be is measured in these quiet movements. It brings perspective. The seasons, which feel so certain, are part of a larger story that has never stopped evolving. They are the result of conditions that have aligned over time, and they continue to exist because that alignment remains. But alignment can change. The same process that once led the planet from chaos to stability can, over long spans, lead it into new forms of balance. The future does not break from the past, it continues it, shaped by the same forces that have always been present. The world is not moving toward an end state. It is moving through a process, and within that process, the seasons are not fixed points. They are expressions of the balance that exists at a given moment. They reflect the current state of the system, not its final form. This understanding settles quietly. The cycles will continue, the patterns will repeat, but they may not remain exactly as they are. The world will carry its rhythm forward, shaped by forces that remain in motion, guiding it into whatever balance comes next. There is no certainty in the exact form that future will take. Only the knowledge that change is part of the system even when it is too slow to see. And as this realization lingers, the story begins to draw closer to its final understanding. The Earth is not defined by a single state, but by its ability to move between them, to hold balance, to lose it, and to find it again. The seasons are part of that movement, and their future, like their past, remains quietly unwritten. The world does not forget, it moves forward, shaped by each change it has experienced, carrying those changes within its structure long after they have passed. What appears stable on the surface is built upon layers of transformation, each one leaving behind a trace that does not disappear. The planet holds its history quietly. Deep within the land, the record exists. Layers form over time, each one shaped by the conditions that once defined the surface. Subtle differences in structure, in composition, in arrangement. These are not random. They are the result of shifts that have taken place across immense spans of time, marking moments when the balance of the planet was different from what it is now. The oceans carry their own form of memory. Their currents move in patterns that have been shaped by countless adjustments, responding to changes that no longer occur, yet still influence the way water flows. The distribution of energy within the oceans reflects a history of variation, a record of how the system has evolved into its present form. The atmosphere, too, bears the imprint of the past. Its behavior, the way it moves, the way it responds to light and temperature, is not created anew with each cycle. It is shaped by processes that have been refined over time, influenced by conditions that once pushed it into instability and later guided it toward balance. These memories are not conscious. They are not stored as thoughts or recalled as images. They exist as structure, as patterns embedded within the systems of the planet. They are present in the way the world behaves, in the way it responds, in the way it continues to move. The past is not separate from the present, it is part of it. The stability that defines the current world was not created by erasing what came before. It was built upon it. Each period of instability, each shift in balance, contributed to the formation of the system that now holds together. The chaos of the early world did not vanish. It was refined, shaped into the variation that now exists within a stable range. This realization changes how the present is understood. The patterns that feel so consistent are not a reset. They are the result of countless adjustments, each one shaping the next. The world has learned, not through intention, but through process, moving toward a balance that reflects everything it has experienced. The planet becomes more than a static system, it becomes a continuity. Every change leaves an imprint. Every shift contributes to the structure that follows. The world carries forward the effects of its past, not as something separate, but as part of the system that exists now. And within that continuity, something deeper begins to take shape. The memory of instability remains embedded in the way the planet behaves. The forces that once created unpredictability still influence the system, though now within limits that allow stability to exist. The past is not gone, it is present, expressed through the subtle variations that continue to shape the world. This presence is quiet, but it is constant. It reminds us that the stability we see is not the absence of change. It is the result of change that has been guided, contained, and refined over time. The world holds together not because it has escaped its past, but because it has incorporated it. The planet remembers, not as a story, not as a sequence of events, but as a structure that reflects everything it has been. The present is shaped by that memory, carrying it forward into each cycle that repeats across the surface. And as this understanding deepens, the focus begins to shift once more. If the planet carries its history within its systems, then life which exists within those systems must carry it as well. The patterns that shape the world have shaped life from the beginning, guiding its development through every stage of its existence. The story does not end with the planet. It continues through what lives upon it, through the forms that have emerged from its changing balance, and through the ways in which those forms carry the memory of the world within themselves. Life does not begin again with each generation. It continues, carrying forward the influence of everything that came before. The forms that exist today are shaped not only by the conditions of the present, but by a history that stretches back to a time when nothing could be trusted to remain the same. That history is still there. It exists within the way life behaves, within the patterns that guide growth, movement, and survival. Even in a world that feels stable, life retains traces of the uncertainty that once defined it. Adaptability remains at its core. Organisms adjust to changes in their environment, even when those changes are small. They respond to variation in light, temperature, and availability of resources, maintaining a flexibility that is not always required in a stable system, yet never disappears. This flexibility is not accidental. It is the result of a past where survival depended on constant adjustment. In a world without reliable patterns, life could not afford to become fixed. It had to remain open to change, capable of responding to whatever conditions emerged. That capacity did not vanish when stability arrived. It remained carried forward through generations, becoming part of the structure of life itself. Even as conditions became more predictable, the ability to adapt stayed embedded within living systems, ready to respond if needed. This can be seen in the way life moves. Migration, in its many forms, reflects an awareness of change across time. Life shifts its position in response to patterns that repeat, but it also retains the ability to adjust when those patterns vary. Movement is not only a response to stability, but a preparation for uncertainty. The same is true for growth. Life does not rely entirely on fixed conditions. It adjusts its development based on the environment, accelerating when conditions allow, slowing when they do not. This flexibility ensures that even when patterns shift, life can continue. Preparation becomes part of existence. Energy is stored not only for immediate use, but for times when conditions may change. Reproduction aligns with favorable periods, yet retains the capacity to adjust if those periods shift. Life behaves as though it expects variation, even in a world that feels stable. The realization begins to take shape. Stability did not erase the influence of chaos. It refined it. The unpredictable world that once shaped life forced it to become adaptable, to develop systems that could respond to change. When stability emerged, those systems did not disappear. They remained, becoming part of the way life interacts with its environment. Life carries the echo of its past. It reflects a history of uncertainty, expressed through behaviors that allow it to respond to variation, even when that variation is minimal. The present may be stable, but life is not entirely dependent on that stability. It has the ability to adjust. This creates a deeper understanding of evolution. It is not a movement toward a final, perfect state. It is a continuous process of preparation. Life does not become fixed in its success. It remains capable of change, shaped by the knowledge embedded within its structure that the world can shift. The connection between past and present becomes clear. The stability of the current world supports life, but the adaptability within life reflects a time when stability did not exist. Both are present, working together to create systems that are both efficient and flexible. This balance allows life to persist. It thrives within stable patterns, yet remains ready for variation. It grows in consistency, yet carries the ability to adjust when that consistency changes. And within that balance, a question begins to emerge. If life remains prepared for uncertainty, if it carries within it the memory of a world that did not follow patterns, what would happen if those patterns began to shift again? The answer lies not only in the planet, but in the interaction between the planet and the life it supports. And as the story continues, that question grows clearer, guiding the narrative toward the possibility that the future may not remain as stable as the present appears. The balance holds, but it is not beyond change. The world moves with a rhythm that feels secure, each cycle following the last with quiet precision. The light returns, the seasons shift, and the patterns continue as though they have settled into a final form. Yet beneath that steady repetition lies a deeper truth. The forces that shape the planet have never stopped moving. The tilt still shifts, slowly adjusting within its range. The orbit continues its path, influenced by subtle variations that accumulate over time. The energy from the sun rises and falls in quiet cycles. The moon maintains its influence, but even that influence is part of a system that is never entirely still. Everything remains in motion, and because it remains in motion, it carries with it the possibility of change. This change does not arrive suddenly. It does not break the system in an instant or return the world to the chaos of its earlier state. Instead, it begins in small ways through variations that are almost too subtle to notice. A slight adjustment in the tilt alters how light reaches the surface. A gradual shift in orbit changes the timing of warmth. A variation in energy from the sun influences the balance of temperature across regions. Each change is small, but together they can begin to reshape the patterns that define the planet. The realization begins to form. The stability of the world depends on alignment. As long as the forces that shape the planet remain within a certain range, the patterns will hold. But if that alignment begins to shift, even slowly, the system can begin to move toward a different balance. The line between stability and instability is not as clear as it seems. It is not a boundary that is crossed in a single moment. It is a range, a spectrum within which the planet moves. The world we experience exists within a stable portion of that range, but it is still part of a larger system that allows for variation. And within that variation lies the possibility of return, not a return to the exact conditions of the past, but a movement toward greater uncertainty. Patterns may begin to loosen, their timing becoming less precise. The cycles may continue, but with shifts that alter their consistency. The change would not de-see the structure that now exists. It would adjust it. The seasons would not disappear, but they might no longer follow the exact TAO that theme today. Warm periods could arrive differently. Cooler intervals could vary in duration. The predictability that feels so certain could begin to soften. This is not a warning. It is a continuation of the process. The same forces that once shaped the early world remain active, still guiding the planet through its ongoing evolution. What has changed is the balance, not the presence of those forces. They are contained now, but containment is not permanence. The past is not separate from the present. It is embedded within it, expressed through the same interactions that continue to shape the world. The conditions that once led to chaos have not vanished. They have been refined into the system that now exists. And because they remain, the possibility of change remains as well. The thought settles quietly. The world is stable, but not fixed. It moves within a balance that can shift, even if only gradually. The patterns that define it are real, but they are part of a system that continues to evolve. The future is not a repetition of the present. It is an extension of the process that has always been unfolding. And within that process, the possibility of return is not something distant or separate. It is part of the same system that created stability in the first place. The difference lies in timing, in alignment, in the subtle movement of forces that never fully stop. As this understanding deepens, the story begins to draw toward its final reflection. The journey from chaos to order was not an ending. It was a phase. And what comes next is shaped by the same quiet forces that have always guided the planet, carrying it forward into whatever balance lies ahead. The rhythm feels ordinary. Morning arrives, light spreads across the sky, and the world begins to move. Evening follows, the light fades, and the quiet of night settles in. Days pass into weeks, weeks into months, and the seasons turn in a sequence so familiar it rarely invites attention. It feels natural, whiskey. Spring brings growth, summer carries warmth, cooler air follows, and then the cycle begins again. These patterns shape daily routines, guide behavior, and influence the way life is lived. They form a structure so consistent that it becomes invisible, something assumed rather than questioned. But this rhythm was not always here. The cycles that now define the present are the result of a long process, one that folded across immense of time. The predictability that feels so certain today was once uncertain, shaped by forces that had not yet aligned. The world we experience is not a default state. It is an outcome, the light that each day does so within a system that has learnt. The seasons that follow one another are not fixed features of the planet, but expressions of a balance that has been built and fend. This balance reaches into everything. It shapes the way life grows, the way environments change, and the way movements occurs across the surface of the planet. It influences when energy is available, when it fades, and how it returns. Every process, from the smallest to the largest, exists within this structure, and within that structure, life has adapted. Not just in form, but in behavior. The rhythm of the planet has become the rhythm of life itself. Actions align with cycles that repeat. Movement follows patterns that return growth, and rest occur in response to changes that can be expected. The connection is so complete that it becomes difficult to separate the two. The world provides the rhythm, and life moves within it. For those who experience this rhythm, it feels permanent. It feels as though it has always been this way. as though the structure of time itself is fixed and unchanging. But that is only how it appears. The patterns that define the present are held in place by conditions that continue to move, to adjust, to interact. The balance that creates them is not static. It is maintained through forces that never fully stop. This realization shifts perspective. The ordinary becomes something else. The rising of the sun, the change of seasons, the steady progression of time. These are not simple events. They are the visible expression of a system that has reached a state of alignment, one that allows these patterns to exist. The world becomes something more complex. What feels stable is the result of continuous interaction. What feels permanent is sustained by processes that remain active beneath the surface. And within that understanding, the present takes on new meaning. The rhythm of life is not separate from the history of the planet. It is shaped by it. Every cycle that repeats carries the influence of the changes that came before, forming a connection between past and present that is always present, even when it is not seen. The world is not just a place where patterns exist. It is a system where patterns are maintained. And those patterns shape everything. The way time is experienced, the way life moves, the way the environment responds, all of it exists within a rhythm that was not always guaranteed. This rhythm surrounds everything, guiding it, supporting it, defining it. And yet it remains part of a larger process, as steady as it feels. It is not beyond change. The forces that hold it together continue to move, continuing to shape the balance that allows it to exist. And as this understanding settles, the focus begins to shift once more. If the rhythm we live inside is maintained rather than fixed, then the forces that stain it become the key to understanding what comes next. The story moves toward those forces, toward the quiet interactions that continue to shape the world, and toward the balance that remains, even now, in motion. The rhythm continues, but it is not held in place by stillness. What appears steady is sustained through constant motion, through interactions that never fully pause. The world does not rest in balance. It maintains it, moment by moment, through forces that continue to shape the planet in quiet, ongoing ways. The tilt remains, guiding the distribution of light across the surface. It does not hold perfectly still. It shifts, slowly, within a range that allows the seasons to repeat. That movement is small, but it is always present, always part of the system. The orbit carries the planet forward, tracing a path that feels predictable, yet is shaped by subtle variations. The distance between the Earth and the Sun changes slightly over time, altering the energy that reaches the surface. These changes are gradual, unfolding across long spans, but they remain part of the balance. The Sun itself continues to provide energy, but not in a perfectly uniform way. Its output varies, rising and falling in patterns that influence the planet. The difference is slight, but it contributes to the system, adding another layer to the balance that holds everything together. And the moon moves alongside it all. Its presence steadies the planet, limiting the range of the tilt and helping maintain the consistency of the cycles. Yet even this influence is not fixed. It is part of a relationship that continues to evolve, shaped by motion that never fully stops. These forces do not act alone. They interact. Each one influences the others, creating a system where balance is not the absence of movement, but the result of it. The tilt affects how light is received. The orbit shapes when that light arrives. The sun provides the energy, and the moon helps to stabilize the entire process. The world holds together because these forces are aligned closely enough to create consistency. But that alignment is not permanent, it is maintained. The realization begins to deepen. Stability is not something the planet has achieved once and for all. It is something the planet continues to create through the interaction of forces that remain active. The balance is dynamic, not static, existing because it is constantly being adjusted. This changes how the present is understood. The calm of the world is not the result of everything settling into place. It is the result of everything continuing to move in a way that supports consistency. The forces that once created unpredictability have not disappeared. They are still here, still influencing the system. The difference is in how they interact. Where once they pushed the planet into instability, now they work in a form of alignment. their variations contained within limits that allow patterns to repeat. The same energy, the same motion, the same influences remain. They have not been removed, they have been balanced. And within that balance, there is always the possibility of change, not as a sudden disruption, but as a gradual shift in alignment. A movement in one force can influence another, creating adjustments that ripple through the system. Over time, these adjustments can alter the balance itself. The world remains stable, but it is not unchanging. It exists within a process that continues to unfold. This process is quiet, almost invisible, yet it shapes everything. The patterns that define the present are sustained through it, held together by interactions that never fully settle. The rhythm we experience is not fixed, it is maintained. And because it is maintained, it can also evolve. The thought does not bring urgency, but awareness. The world is stable because it is constantly adjusting, because the forces that shape it remain in motion, responding to one another in ways that support the balance that exists now. This balance is real, but it is not final. It is part of a larger process that continues guiding the planet forward through time. And as this understanding settles, the story begins to move toward its final reflection. If stability is something the planet continues to create, then the future is not a fixed outcome. It is something that will be shaped by the same forces that have always been at work, carrying the world into whatever balance comes next. The light returns. It rises without hesitation, spreading across the surface of the planet in the same quiet way it always has. It touches the oceans, the land, the atmosphere, illuminating a world that feels steady, ordered, and familiar. Nothing about this moment seems unusual. The sky brightens, the air shifts. The patterns of the world continue as they did before, moving in rhythms that feel dependable, almost permanent. It is easy to believe that this is how it has always been, that the light has always arrived in this way, guiding a system that has never faltered. But that is not the full story. The light that reaches the planet today is the same force that once touched a world without rhythm, a world where its rhythm did not follow a predictable. It is the same energy that moved across an unstable surface, shaping conditions that had not yet found balance. It has never changed. What has changed is the world it touches. The earth beneath that light has moved through phases of uncertainty, through periods where nothing repeated, where patterns could not hold. It has shifted, adjusted, and gradually formed the balance that now defines it. The light has been there through all of it. It illuminated chaos, it revealed instability. It carried energy into systems that could not yet organize themselves. And over time it became part of the process that allowed those systems to find rhythm. The present moment carries all of that history. The steady rise of light is not just a daily event, it is the continuation of a process that has never stopped. Each arrival connects the present to the past, linking the stable world of today to the same world that came before. The difference lies in how the planet responds. Where once the light fell upon a system that could not hold its patterns, now it meets a world that reflects it in structured ways. The oceans absorb and release its energy in cycles that repeat. The atmosphere moves in response to its presence, shaping patterns that follow its path. Life itself aligns with its rhythm, growing and resting, in response to its return. The light has not become more consistent, the world has. And yet, even within that consistency, the process continues. The forces that shape the planet remain in motion, still adjusting, still interacting, still guiding the balance that allows this moment to exist. The stability that defines the present is not separate from that movement. It is created by it. This realization settles quietly. The world is not complete, it is not fixed in a final state where change no longer occurs. It continues, shaped by the same forces that have always been at work, moving through time in a way that allows balance to exist, but never guarantees it. The light returns, but it does not arrive in the same way twice. Each moment carries subtle differences, small variations in how energy moves, how systems respond, how the balance holds. These differences are often too small to notice, but they are part of the process, part of the ongoing evolution of the planet. The present is not a repetition, it is a continuation. The cycles we observe are expressions of a system that remains active, not static. The stability we experience is real, but it exists within a process that continues to unfold moment by moment, cycle by cycle. And within that process, the future remains open. The world will continue to move, to adjust, to respond. The balance will hold, shift and reform, guided by forces that never fully settle. The patterns may remain familiar, or they may evolve into something new. The story does not end here. It extends beyond this moment, beyond what can be seen, carried forward by the same light that has always reached the planet, illuminating each stage of its journey. The Earth turns, the light returns, and the process continues.